I'm Brenna Stewart, 38 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life walking a tightrope, balancing a demanding career in finance with the complicated, often painful dynamics of my family life. By day, I analyze numbers, forecasts, and portfolios, navigating the high-stress world of financial markets with precision and calm. By night, I step into a far less predictable role, the daughter who's always expected to fix problems that aren't hers, the one who quietly bears burdens no one else seems to acknowledge. For as long as I can remember, my family has leaned on me, not just for advice or emotional support, but financially. I was the one who helped pay off debts, covered medical bills, and stepped in when others faltered. I did it because I loved them, because I believed that family is a bond stronger than any hardship. But with every sacrifice, I felt a little more invisible, a little more like a ghost in my own life, present, but unseen. The last family dinner crystallized all of that pain into a sharp, undeniable truth. It was supposed to be ordinary, just another gathering around the worn oak table in my parents' house, a place that, for all its familiarity, had become a battleground of silent judgments and unspoken resentments. The air was thick with tension, and beneath the polite chatter, I could feel the undercurrent of disdain, the weight of all the times I'd been dismissed or blamed. Then my father spoke. His voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "You're a burden," he said, eyes cold and unyielding. "We want to live without you. Get out now." The words landed with brutal finality. My mother, ever the enigma, just smiled, a slow, measured smile, as she sipped her wine, her silence a quiet endorsement of his cruelty. I remember the moment vividly, the clink of my glass as I set it down on the table, the soft shuffle of my chair as I stood, the sound of my own breathing, steady but shaken. My children sat nearby, their faces marked with confusion and hurt. My husband Mark, always my rock, looked as stunned as I felt, his eyes searching mine for a signal, a plan, something to hold on to. I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, paying my share of the meal without a word. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained calm as I told them I was leaving. I walked out the front door into the cool night air, the world outside buzzing quietly with indifferent life. The streetlights cast long shadows as I stepped away from the house, away from the stifling weight of expectation and rejection. That night, as I wandered through the city streets, the cold air bit at my skin, but it also cleared my mind. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside me. Not just pain or shock, but a fierce determination. The family I had tried so hard to please had rejected me outright. And yet, in that rejection, I found a strange kind of freedom. Walking alone under the dim glow of street lamps, I realized I had exhausted every attempt to earn their approval, every sacrifice, every silent compromise, every attempt to smooth over the cracks had been met with disdain or outright cruelty. The moment my father's words hung in the air, the illusion shattered. I was no longer willing to absorb their poison silently. The city around me was alive and indifferent, its noise a background hum to my swirling thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating my face, which was set now with a calm resolve that surprised even me. I thought about Mark and the children, about the future I wanted for us, a future free from the shadows of this family's toxic expectations. That night marked the beginning of something new. Whatever came next, I knew I had crossed a line. The Brenna who had endured and excused for so long was giving way to someone else. Someone who wouldn't be silenced, ignored, or cast aside. And while the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with risk, I felt ready to walk it, alone if I had to. The dinner table, once the site of so many silent battles and hidden wounds, now felt like the place where my life had irrevocably changed. I turned my back on the house, the past, and all the invisible chains. The night stretched before me, dark, unknown, but suddenly filled with possibility. And as I walked, the weight inside me began to lift, replaced by a fierce, quiet strength that would carry me forward. From the very beginning, the fault lines in my family were etched deep beneath the surface, so deep that I barely recognized them for what they were until years later. My younger brother Ryan was always the golden child. I remember when he was barely old enough to walk. My parents' eyes would light up whenever he said or did anything. Even the smallest achievement was met with applause and high praise. His every success was celebrated as if it were a family triumph, a reflection of their perfect parenting. Meanwhile, I, their firstborn, was sidelined and scrutinized. It wasn't just subtle favoritism. It was a constant, unspoken rule. Ryan deserved the best, and I was the one who was expected to sacrifice. If anything went wrong, household bills piling up, family tensions rising, even minor accidents, it was somehow my fault. The blame fell on me like a shadow that stretched over every part of my childhood. I was the problem to be managed, the burden that needed to be corrected. I can still feel the sting of countless moments when my accomplishments were dismissed or overshadowed. I remember bringing home good grades, or winning a small award and being met with fleeting acknowledgement, if any, at all. "That's nice, Brenna," my mother would say, her tone polite but distant, before turning her attention back to Ryan's latest achievement. He was their pride, their hope, the child they believed would carry the family legacy forward. I was left to clean up the emotional and practical messes behind the scenes, a role I reluctantly accepted because I craved their approval. The resources poured into Ryan's upbringing were staggering. He had the best tutors, the newest gadgets, the opportunities that seemed hand-picked to ensure he would excel. Meanwhile, I had to fight silently for what little I was given, learning early on that asking for more meant inviting criticism. When I expressed hurt or frustration, it was dismissed as oversensitivity or selfishness. "Toughen up, Brenna," my father would say, his voice firm and unyielding. This is how the real world works. I rationalized their behavior as tough love, convincing myself that their high expectations were a form of care, even if it often felt cruel. I believed that if I just worked harder, sacrificed more, showed more loyalty, I could earn their respect. But with each attempt, the gulf between us grew wider. Their love was conditional, given only when I conformed to their narrow definition of worth. Family holidays were particularly painful. The dinner table was a minefield of judgments and comparisons. Ryan, shining and confident, was the center of attention. I was relegated to the background, my efforts invisible or worse, met with subtle rebukes. When I spoke up or tried to share my successes, the conversation would shift quickly back to Ryan's latest triumphs, as if my voice didn't belong in that space. Their dismissive attitude extended beyond words. When I confided in my parents about struggles at school or with friends, they minimized my feelings, emphasizing resilience and self-reliance, qualities that sounded more like demands to endure silence than genuine support. It was as if they saw my emotional needs as weaknesses to be corrected, rather than parts of me to be nurtured. Over time, I grew accustomed to swallowing my pain, masking the loneliness that came with being the family's scapegoat. I developed a quiet resilience, a steel interior that protected me from breaking under the weight of their expectations and rejection. But inside, the hurt festered, a deep well of sadness and anger that I dared not express. Even my relationship with Ryan was complicated. He was both a victim and a beneficiary of our parents' favoritism. I loved him, but I resented him too. The way he seemed shielded from criticism, how easily he earned affection that I had to fight for. He didn't fully understand the role he played in the family dynamic, nor did he realize how deeply I was wounded by the constant comparisons. Looking back, those early years were the foundation of a toxic pattern that shaped every family interaction that followed. The messages I received were clear. I was expendable, a problem to be managed, and my value was measured only by what I could give up for others, never by who I was. This early emotional landscape set the stage for the pain and betrayal I experienced as an adult, the very pain that would eventually push me to reclaim my voice and my dignity. As a child, I clung to hope that with patience and sacrifice, I could break through their cold indifference. But even then, the signs were unmistakable. The family that should have been my refuge was a place where my achievements were invisible, my needs ignored, and my spirit diminished. Those years taught me the harshest lesson. Love in my family was conditional, and I was never going to be enough, no matter how hard I tried. Over the years, I've been the silent backbone of the Stewart family, the one who stepped in whenever things spiraled out of control. It wasn't a role I ever asked for, but somehow it became my burden, a heavy weight disguised as obligation. I remember countless nights sitting at my kitchen table with Mark, poring over bills and medical statements, calculating how we could possibly cover what my parents couldn't or wouldn't manage. Their mounting debts, unpaid credit cards, hospital fees, these weren't just numbers to me. They were my family's crises, and I absorbed them all like a sponge, even though it drained me. Sometimes I think back to those long phone calls with my mother, Evelyn, her voice light and charming on the surface but underpinned by a quiet desperation. "Brenna, you're the only one I can count on," she'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And every time, despite the exhaustion and the gnawing resentment, I promised I'd help. Because beneath it all, I wanted to believe in the family that had raised me, even if they never made that same promise to me. Mark has been my steadfast partner throughout it all. He's seen firsthand the sacrifices I made, turning down promotions, spending weekends on the phone with collection agencies, rearranging our own finances to bail out my parents yet again. We put our dreams on hold more times than I can count. There were trips we canceled, a new home we postponed buying, and personal investments we shelved, all so that the Stewarts wouldn't collapse under their own mismanagement. Mark never once complained, but I could see in his eyes the weariness, the quiet frustration of standing on the sidelines while my family took and took without gratitude. The emotional cost was just as steep as the financial one. My time, my energy, my mental health, all stretched thin to cover the cracks in a family that seemed incapable of repairing itself. I attended doctor's appointments for my aging grandparents, coordinated care schedules, and managed prescriptions, even when it meant sacrificing my own sleep or pushing through work days with a pounding headache. I was exhausted, often overwhelmed, but I swallowed the fatigue and kept going, because I was the responsible one, the one who didn't complain, the one who was expected to fix everything. And yet, none of it earned me any real recognition. Gerald, my father, had a way of turning every conversation back to Ryan. "Your brother knows how to make things work," he'd say with a proud nod, as if my efforts were invisible or insignificant. Evelyn, ever the socialite, would nod and smile, clinking her wineglass in agreement, her approval always reserved for Ryan's achievements, never for the sacrifices I quietly made. Ryan thrived, shielded by their unwavering favoritism, while I remained the invisible workhorse, carrying burdens that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Even my children felt the ripple effects of this dynamic. I worried about the example I was setting, of always putting others first, sometimes at my own expense. Mark and I talked late into the night about how our kids might grow up watching me be taken for granted, and what lessons that might teach them about self-worth and boundaries. It was a constant tension, balancing my desire to support my family with the need to protect my own little family's future. Still, through it all, I clung to hope that my loyalty and sacrifices would finally be seen, that someday, my parents would look at me not just as a financial resource or an emotional dumping ground, but as the daughter I was. I wanted to believe that beneath their coldness, there was a flicker of gratitude or love that could be rekindled. But with every passing year, the hope dimmed a little more, replaced by a growing sense of invisibility and exhaustion. So I carried on, juggling the impossible roles of financial savior, emotional caretaker, and peacemaker, all while maintaining my professional life. I became an expert at masking my pain, smiling when I was hurting, answering every call for help even when I wanted to scream. Because that's what family does, right? We sacrifice, we endure, we give until there's nothing left. But deep down, beneath the layers of obligation and endurance, a part of me was breaking. The girl who once dreamt of a family that loved her unconditionally was slipping away, replaced by a woman who was beginning to question the fairness of it all. How long could I keep giving when I was never considered enough? How much more could I give before I lost myself completely? That question lingered in the back of my mind as I sat through yet another dinner conversation, where Ryan's successes were celebrated and my contributions were dismissed. It was an ache that gnawed at me silently, one that I wrapped tightly in a coat of professionalism and quiet resolve. Somewhere beneath the surface, I knew that my hope was fragile, and my patience was running thin. But I kept going, because that's what I had been trained to do. Put family first, no matter the cost. Yet, that cost was becoming impossible to ignore. The sacrifices were piling up, and the returns, recognition, love, respect, were nowhere in sight. I wasn't just invisible, I was becoming a ghost in my own story, fading into the background of a family that only saw me as a means to an end. And still, I clung to the hope that one day, something would change, that my loyalty would be repaid with gratitude, that my sacrifices would finally matter. But deep down, I was beginning to realize that hope might be the most dangerous thing of all. The memory of that day still strikes a raw chord deep inside me. It was my sister-in-law's wedding last year, a day that was meant to be filled with joy and celebration. The church was decorated with soft white flowers and delicate ribbons, the air buzzing with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Guests in their finest attire milled about, exchanging congratulations and posing for photos. It was one of those gatherings where happiness was supposed to be effortless, where family bonds felt strong and unbreakable, or so I hoped. But beneath the polished surface, my family's undercurrents ran just as turbulent as ever. I remember standing near the reception hall's entrance, adjusting the hem of my dress, trying to smile as relatives I barely spoke to approached me with polite niceties. My husband Mark was beside me, his hand steadying mine, a quiet anchor in a sea of social expectations. The children were off playing with cousins, their gleeful laughter a welcome distraction. Then my father, Gerald, arrived with his usual air of authority, flanked by my mother, Evelyn, whose practiced social smile never quite reached her eyes. They moved through the crowd like royalty, commanding attention, but what I dreaded was how their gaze settled on me, cool, dismissive, weighing me as if I were a problem rather than family. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Gerald's voice, loud and clear, cut through the murmur of conversations, drawing unwanted attention. "You know," he said, voice dripping with disdain, "Brenna's always been selfish, never thinks beyond herself. Unlike Ryan, he knows how to contribute, how to be useful." The words hung heavy in the air. I froze, cheeks burning as several heads turned toward us. My heart pounded in my chest, a hot flush spreading through me. I wanted to disappear into the crowd, to vanish beneath the polished surface of that glittering hall, but I couldn't. The sting of his words wasn't just personal, it was public humiliation. My mother's reaction was what hurt the most. Instead of intervening or offering any kind of defense, she chuckled softly, raising her wine glass in a subtle toast, eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. That slow smile, so practiced and cold, cut deeper than any words. It was a signal of complicity, a silent agreement that I was fair game. Around us, the guests shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact, others exchanged awkward glances. My husband's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, knowing that sparking a scene would only fuel the fire. My younger brother Ryan, standing a little apart, gave me a brief, uncertain look, a mix of sympathy tangled with embarrassment, then quickly turned away, retreating into the familiar spotlight. The humiliation wasn't just about my father's words. It was the way they echoed years of neglect and rejection, crystallizing all the silent suffering I'd buried deep inside. To be called selfish and useless in front of everyone, family, friends, even strangers, felt like a verdict passed on my very worth. It was as if all the sacrifices I had made, the late nights working extra hours, the money lent without expectation of repayment, the emotional labor I carried, it meant nothing. Throughout that evening, I moved like a ghost among the guests, my smile forced and brittle. I observed the way my parents lavished praise on Ryan with every opportunity, their words dripping with pride when speaking of his college achievements, his job promotions, his marriage, their golden boy. Meanwhile, I was relegated to the margins, my contributions invisible as if I were merely an ornament to the family's image. Inside, a storm raged. Part of me wanted to confront them, to voice the years of pain concealed beneath my quiet demeanor. But another part, The part trained to avoid conflict at all costs, kept me silent. I told myself to be patient, to endure. Maybe, just maybe, this was a rough patch, something that could be smoothed over with time and effort. That night, as the wedding festivities wound down and guests began to leave, I sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of water, my fingers trembling slightly. Mark sat beside me, his hand warm over mine. "You okay?" he asked gently. I forced a smile, nodding. "I'm fine, just tired." But I wasn't fine. The party's joy felt like a cruel contrast to the ache settling deep inside me. I thought about my children, wondering what kind of family legacy I was passing on to them, one where love was conditional and worth measured in who got the spotlight. The memory of that wedding day became a turning point. For years, I had held on to the hope that if I just kept trying, kept sacrificing, my family would finally see me. But that night shattered the illusion. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was outright contempt, displayed for all to witness. I left the wedding early with Mark. Outside, the cool night air touched my skin, a sharp reminder of reality. The twinkling city lights offered no comfort. I realized then that my place in my family was not going to change on their terms. If I wanted respect, I would have to claim it myself. That was the moment I began to question everything I had believed about loyalty and sacrifice. The family that was supposed to be my refuge had become a source of pain, and I was no longer certain I could bear it in silence. As we drove home that night, the city's hum fading behind us, I made a silent promise to myself. No more invisibility. No more enduring cruelty masked as familial love. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew I had crossed a line. My hope for reconciliation was faltering, and a flicker of resolve, cold and steady, was taking its place. Last week's family dinner was supposed to be just another gathering, something ordinary, familiar, but beneath the surface, everything was charged with an unspoken tension that I could feel like static in the air. The worn oak table, scarred with years of meals and arguments, sat in the center of the room, surrounded by faces I knew too well, faces that had long ceased to offer me comfort or warmth. My parents, Gerald and Evelyn, sat at the head of the table, their expressions the same carefully controlled masks I had learned to read so well over the years. From the moment I arrived, I could sense something different. The way Gerald's eyes flicked over me, cold, dismissive, like I was a shadow he wished would disappear. Evelyn, her lips curved in that slow, inscrutable smile, swirling the wine in her glass with an almost casual cruelty. My brother Ryan sat next to them, the ever-pleased golden child, looking smug and shielded, his presence a reminder of the imbalanced scales in this family. The dinner started with the usual forced pleasantries, the clatter of silverware, the low hum of polite conversation, all masking the undercurrent of disdain that pulsed just beneath the surface. I tried to keep my voice steady, to maintain the calm facade I'd perfected over decades. My children were seated nearby, their innocent eyes flicking between the adults, sensing the tension without understanding it. Mark was beside me, his usually steady presence now tight with barely concealed disappointment. And then it happened. Gerald's voice cut through the room like a stone thrown into still water, shattering whatever fragile piece remained. "You're a burden," he said, his tone flat but sharp, each word striking me with brutal precision. The room fell silent. I felt all eyes turn to me, some expectant, some indifferent, but all judgmental. "We want to live without you. Get out, now," he added, the finality in his voice leaving no room for argument. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a suffocating fog. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my hands clench under the table, nails digging into my palms in a desperate attempt to ground myself. The world seemed to slow. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of cars passing outside, but none of it mattered. All I could hear were those words, repeated silently in my mind. "You're a burden. Get out." My mother, Evelyn, responded not with words or a protest, but with something far colder, a smile. That slow, deliberate smile as she raised her wine glass to her lips and took a sip, eyes glinting with approval. Her silence was no accident. It was a quiet agreement, a tacit endorsement of my father's cruelty. It was as if she was saying, without uttering a sound, "Yes, this is how it has to be." I glanced toward my children. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and hurt, their little brows furrowed in a way that broke my heart. I could see their struggle to comprehend such harshness from their grandparents, this rejection so blatant and raw. Mark's hand found mine, giving a gentle squeeze, their shared shock mirrored in his eyes as he searched mine for some kind of response, some plan, some anchor. But for a moment, I was frozen. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. I could barely process the depth of what had just been said, the decades of hidden contempt erupting all at once. My body trembled slightly as I reached into my purse, pulling out my wallet. My hands, though shaking, moved with deliberate calm as I counted out my share of the dinner bill. Not a word escaped my lips. I refused to dignify the cruelty with a response. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed deafening in the silence that had enveloped the room. I spoke quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I'm leaving." Turning my back on the gathered family, I walked out the front door and into the night. The cool air was sharp against my skin, biting away some of the sting of those words. Streetlights cast long shadows as I moved away from the house, away from the suffocating legacy of neglect and disdain. Around me, the city buzzed with life, indifferent, chaotic, and yet somehow freeing. That walk was a turning point. My mind raced, cycling through every memory of sacrifice and dismissal. Every moment I had swallowed pain to keep the fragile illusion of family alive. But now, with Gerald's words echoing in my ears, and Evelyn's unsettling smile burned into my memory, the illusion shattered completely. I thought about Mark and the children, their faces still etched with confusion and hurt. I thought about the future, our future, and the life I wanted to build, free from this toxic cycle of rejection and invisibility. The weight of decades of emotional labor lifted ever so slightly, replaced by a fierce, icy resolve. In that cold night air, walking alone beneath the flickering street lamps, I realized that everything had changed. The family I had fought so hard to belong to had made their feelings clear. I was no longer just overlooked. I was unwanted. And yet, in that rejection, something unexpected stirred, a quiet strength, a refusal to be diminished any longer. The night stretched ahead, uncertain and dark, but I felt ready to face it, because sometimes the most profound moments of clarity come wrapped in pain. And that night, standing on the edge of everything I thought I knew about family, I understood that I would no longer be their burden. I would no longer carry their poison silently. The path ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain: I was done being invisible. That night, as I stepped away from the house and into the cool embrace of the city's darkness, grief settled over me like a dense, suffocating blanket. But beneath that heavy sorrow, something colder began to take shape, a clarity forged by years of silent suffering and unacknowledged sacrifice. The fog of hope I had clung to for so long started to lift, revealing the harsh, unvarnished truth I'd been too afraid to face until now. I found a quiet bench beneath a flickering street lamp and sat down, the night air sharp against my skin, pulling me into wakefulness. My hands rested in my lap, trembling slightly, not from the chill, but from the tidal wave of emotions crashing inside me. I closed my eyes briefly and let my mind replay those moments at the dinner table. My father's words, so brutal and deliberate, slicing through years of pretense. My mother's smile, so carefully composed, so venomous in its silence. For so long, I had been the family's invisible pillar, the one who carried the weight no one else wanted to bear. I reviewed, in painful detail, the years I had given, the countless bills I'd paid off behind the scenes, the emergencies I'd navigated when no one else stepped up, the late nights spent comforting trembling relatives or holding back my own tears to be the strong one. Every sacrifice, every gesture of love had been met not with gratitude, but with cold dismissal or outright hostility. The pattern was unmistakable now. It wasn't just neglect, it was exploitation. They had leaned on me, drained me emotionally and financially, as if I were an endless resource. Their indifference was a chasm I had tried to bridge with loyalty and hard work, but that chasm was bottomless. My pain was a background noise to their lives, something to ignore or, worse, use against me. I thought about the way my father would redirect every conversation to Ryan, praising him for achievements I had no role in and ignoring the sacrifices I made. How my mother's smiles and social graces masked a calculated coldness, a refusal to acknowledge my worth. How my brother, wrapped in their favor, thrived while I was expected to disappear, to bear the burden silently, without complaint. The realization settled like ice in my veins. These people, these parents who should have been my refuge, had never truly loved me the way I needed. Their love was conditional, tied to what I could provide or endure, never given freely or unconditionally. The hope I'd carried, that if I just tried harder, if I just sacrificed more, if I just kept silent, they would see me, would appreciate me, would finally accept me, was a fragile illusion shattered by cold reality. As the night deepened, I felt a shift inside me. Grief transformed into something harder, colder, a steely resolve. I owed them nothing. I had spent too long giving pieces of myself to a family that only saw me as a burden, a fixer, a wallet, a scapegoat. Forgiveness, which I had once considered a balm for the hurt, now seemed like surrender. I was done surrendering. I pictured my children's faces, innocent, trusting, looking to me as their protector. I thought about Mark, steadfast and patient, who had stood quietly by as I bore this invisible weight. I realized that protecting them meant setting boundaries, demanding respect, and reclaiming my dignity. It meant no longer allowing the people who hurt me to dictate the terms of my life. The city around me hummed with distant sounds. The occasional car passing, a dog barking far off, footsteps echoing on empty sidewalks. But inside, my mind was silent, clear. I was no longer tangled in the web of denial and hope. I saw the truth plainly. I was done being their safety net, their emotional dumping ground. I was done being invisible. The bench beneath the street lamp creaked as I stood, a small sound in the vast stillness. The night stretched before me, uncertain, daunting, but charged with possibility. The Brenna who had endured, who had begged for acceptance, who had silently borne the weight of their cruelty, was beginning to fade. In her place stood someone new, resolved, unyielding, ready to protect herself at all costs. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and felt a quiet fire ignite within me. The path ahead was unclear, and the risks were real, but the pain had sharpened my focus. I would no longer be their burden. I would no longer stand silent while they dismissed me. I would make them face the truth, and I would demand the respect I deserved. As I walked away from the bench, the shadows of the city wrapped around me like armor. That night marked a turning point, a moment when grief gave way to icy clarity and weakness transformed into strength. And though the road forward was lonely and fraught with uncertainty, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was ready to fight for myself. That night, as the cold air steadied my racing heart, I began to piece together the extent of how deeply the Stewarts depended on me, the invisible scaffolding holding up a crumbling facade. My mind sifted through years of tangled financial ties and emotional strings, and the picture that emerged was startling. I was no longer just the family's fixer. I was the linchpin in a network of debts, legal entanglements, and fragile alliances that, once unraveled, could bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. I remembered signing my name on loan documents years ago, initially as a favor, co-signing to help my parents secure better interest rates or qualify for credit when their own histories were tarnished by missed payments. Those signatures were more than ink on paper. They were chains binding me to their financial missteps. Over time, I'd acquired oversight of shared bank accounts, credit cards, and investments, arrangements I never sought but accepted, almost instinctively, because what daughter wouldn't help her parents? The truth was, my name was everywhere in their financial world, a safety net they'd come to rely on without so much as a thank you. I pulled out the folders I'd amassed over the years, carefully kept financial statements, tax documents, medical bills marked paid by Brenna, and letters from collection agencies that I'd handled quietly so my parents wouldn't have to face the shame. Each paper was a testament to sacrifices made in silence, a ledger not just of money, but of emotional labor. As I flipped through pages, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Not just the dollars and cents, but the way they'd treated me as nothing more than a resource. But the more I examined, the more I found signs of recklessness and manipulation that went beyond mere carelessness. Gerald's business ventures, which he bragged about at family gatherings, were riddled with hidden debts and questionable partnerships I'd quietly helped cover. Evelyn's charm masked a calculated effort to maintain social appearances while avoiding responsibility, her passive smiles concealing schemes to sidestep obligations. Ryan, my brother, untouched by financial burdens, lived comfortably in the shadow of their manipulations, shielded by their favoritism. I realized that my access to key legal documents, wills, powers of attorney, property deeds, placed me in a unique position. Over the years, my parents had entrusted me with these responsibilities, or rather, assumed I would take them, because who else would? But with that trust came the power to reshape my role in their lives. It was a power I'd never wielded before, but now, in the icy clarity of that night, it felt like the first step toward reclaiming control. I started compiling a mental inventory of what I needed: copies of all legal agreements, loan contracts, financial statements, and correspondence that demonstrated not only my involvement, but their mismanagement. I knew I couldn't confront them with vague accusations. I would need concrete evidence meticulously documented. I resolved to consult a lawyer who specialized in family financial disputes and estate planning, someone who could advise me on revising my role as co-signer, executor, and beneficiary. The plan began to form quietly, methodically. I would not rush into confrontation or emotional outbursts. Instead, I would gather facts, build a case, and let their own actions undo the narrative they'd spun for years. The story where I was the problem and they were the victims. I would protect my assets, secure my children's future, and set clear boundaries that even the most manipulative family tactics couldn't breach. Beneath my calm exterior, a strategic mind was awakening, analyzing every interaction, every shared account password, every informal agreement I'd entered without full consent. I started changing passwords on financial apps and email accounts linked to family matters, restricting access gently but firmly. I made notes about every financial transaction I had authorized on their behalf, especially those that had never been reimbursed or even acknowledged. At the same time, I began a quiet documentation of emotional abuses. Every insult, every dismissal, every veiled criticism stored away in my memory like evidence. These weren't just family squabbles. They were patterns of manipulation and control that had shaped my entire adult life. I made voice memos and journal entries, capturing the emotional toll, knowing that to truly protect myself, I needed to build both a financial and emotional case. I reached out to trusted friends and Mark, sharing only what was necessary, but enough to confirm that I wasn't losing perspective. Mark's support was unwavering, a calm harbor in a sea of uncertainty. Together, we discussed the legal steps ahead, the emotional boundaries I needed, and how to shield our children from the fallout. As the night deepened, I felt the icy resolve hardening inside me. This wasn't about revenge or vengeance. It was about survival, emotional, financial, and spiritual survival. The family that had drained me for so long was about to face a reckoning they never anticipated. I would no longer be their invisible safety net or silent victim. The first moves were subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, but beneath that calm surface, the gears of change were turning. And as I closed the files and tucked them away, I knew the journey ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power, not the hollow power of compliance or sacrifice, but the real, hard-earned power of self-preservation. The night was far from over, and the path ahead uncertain, but I was ready to step into this new role, protector of myself and my family, no longer a pawn in their toxic game. That following week, I began the delicate process of pulling back, subtly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly at first. It wasn't a sudden severing, It was a gradual unspooling of the countless threads that had tied me to the Stewart family's relentless demands. I knew that an abrupt withdrawal would provoke chaos, maybe even desperation, but I wanted to maintain control, to keep the upper hand while they remained unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. My phone, once ringing endlessly throughout the day with requests, complaints, or thinly veiled accusations, started to feel different. I began letting calls go unanswered, especially those that came during busy work hours or late at night. When I did answer, my responses were clipped, carefully neutral, designed to convey availability without commitment. "I'm tied up right now," I'd say gently but firmly. "I'll have to get back to you." More often than not, I never called back. The sound of my phone's silent voicemail became a quiet refuge I hadn't realized I'd craved. Financially, I started to pull away with small, incremental changes. Where before I had immediately transferred funds to cover a forgotten bill or cleared an overdraft without a word, now I delayed payments or reduced the amounts I sent. I didn't cut them off completely, yet, but I began to prioritize our own household, our own bills, our own future. It was painful to restrain my impulse to fix everything, but I reminded myself that this was necessary. They had taken my generosity for granted for too long. The caregiving duties, which I had always accepted without question, became a boundary I was unwilling to cross anymore. When my mother called last minute, asking if I could drive to the pharmacy to pick up her prescriptions or check in on my aging grandmother, I started declining more often. I gave polite excuses, work deadlines, Mark's schedule, the children's activities, but beneath those words was a firm decision. I would no longer be their errand girl, their unpaid nurse, their emotional crutch. The burden had shifted, and I was reclaiming my time, my energy, my life. Meanwhile, I moved to tighten my control over the digital and legal aspects that had long been loose threads in this family saga. Passwords to shared financial accounts and email were quietly changed. I set up two-factor authentication where possible, and I logged out of apps where my access had been assumed but was no longer necessary. It was a silent but potent assertion of autonomy, closing doors they thought were open forever. The legal documents, wills, powers of attorney, financial authorizations, were quietly reviewed with my lawyer. I gathered files and statements, scanning and organizing them meticulously. Every paper told a story. Debts co-signed, loans approved, bills paid, and favors granted that had never been repaid or even acknowledged. I created a digital archive, password-protected and accessible only to Mark and me, a fortress of evidence that would underpin whatever steps I chose to take next. In social settings, I adopted a new posture, calm, controlled, and emotionally detached. When family members noticed my more distant behavior, they commented, sometimes with concern, often with thinly veiled irritation. My mother made a few pointed remarks about how I was pulling away or being difficult. My father grunted dismissively, as if my absence was inconsequential. Ryan tried to engage me more, perhaps sensing the shift, but I kept conversations brief and non-committal. At home, Mark was my steadfast ally. We had long talks in the quiet of the evening, reviewing my plans, discussing the legal advice, and mapping out boundaries for future interactions. Mark cautioned me against rushing, reminding me to take care of myself and our children first. His steady presence gave me strength when doubt crept in, grounding me when the emotional stakes felt overwhelming. The most difficult moments were when I imagined the hurt and confusion this retreat would cause my children if it escalated. I wanted to shield them from family drama, to preserve their innocence, but I knew that protecting our little family meant standing firm, even if it meant breaking ties with the larger one. Their future well-being depended on the example I set now, that self-respect is non-negotiable. Despite the outward calm, the tension was palpable. The subtle changes stirred ripples beneath the surface. My parents noticed the slower replies, the declined requests, the diminished financial support. They grumbled among themselves, exchanged wary glances, but they still underestimated how serious I was. I kept my composure, maintaining a facade of civility, while inside a quiet fire burned, fueled by years of pain and betrayal. This was no longer about hoping for approval or acceptance. It was about survival, about reclaiming my life from a family that had long treated me as a disposable resource. The small moves I made that week, refusing calls, withdrawing funds, setting boundaries, were the first steps of an uprising I had planned carefully in the shadows. They didn't see it yet, but the ground was shifting beneath their feet. And as I closed my laptop each night, locking away the documents that spelled out their recklessness and my sacrifices, I felt a cold satisfaction. The Brenna who had absorbed every insult and paid every bill was fading. In her place was someone resolute, someone ready to fight for dignity and fairness, someone who would no longer be anyone's burden. 1 week after that shattering dinner, I took definitive, unyielding steps to sever the ties that had bound me to the Stewart family's relentless demands. I wasn't acting impulsively. Every move was calculated, precise, and backed by the mountain of evidence I'd painstakingly assembled during those long, sleepless nights. The transformation from silent victim to empowered architect of change was complete, and I was ready to reclaim my life on my terms. The first thing I did was cut off all financial support. For years, my bank account had been the family's safety net, an invisible vault that covered overdrafts, late medical bills, and forgotten credit card payments. I stopped transferring funds to their accounts. I let the balance slowly dwindle, knowing the consequences wouldn't just be discomfort, they would be real hardship. The phone calls started almost immediately. Gerald's voice, once full of arrogant entitlement, shifted to desperation. Evelyn's usual composure cracked under the strain, but I held firm. Next, I formally revoked my co-signing on their loans. Those signatures I'd given years ago, meant to help them navigate tight spots, had become chains that tethered me to their financial recklessness. With the advice of my lawyer, I contacted the banks, submitted the necessary paperwork, and withdrew my consent. It was a legal severance of responsibility, and I couldn't suppress the cold satisfaction as I imagined their shock when those institutions started calling them directly, no longer shielded by my name or credit. But it wasn't only about money. I took the bold step of legally removing them from my will and power of attorney documents. Over the years, I'd been named as a key beneficiary and trustee, expected to manage their estates and decisions. Now, I reversed course. I drafted new legal documents, executed with Mark's unwavering support, that excluded my parents entirely. It was a quiet but irreversible declaration. I would no longer be the fallback, the executor, or the heir to their toxic legacy. The most difficult but necessary act of all was exposing Gerald's hidden debts and financial mismanagement to other relatives. For years, he'd boasted about his business acumen, painting a picture of success that masked a fragile house of cards. I reached out to trusted family members, cousins, aunts, and uncles, sharing the documents I had uncovered, unpaid bills, liens, and questionable loans he'd taken without transparency. Their reactions ranged from shock to disbelief, but many expressed gratitude that someone had finally pulled back the curtain. Evelyn's carefully maintained social image began to crack as whispers spread about her role in enabling the deceit and manipulation. At the same time, I confided in close family friends whom my parents had long manipulated with charm and falsehoods. I told them the truth about Evelyn's passive complicity, the way she smiled over wine as cruelty unfolded, the subtle ways she maintained control by staying silent. These revelations changed the narrative circulating in our social circles, shifting sympathy away from my parents and toward me. It was no small victory to see the facade crumble, though I knew the battle was far from over. I also made a protective, painful decision regarding my children. I withdrew them from all future family events indefinitely. I couldn't expose them to the hostility and rejection that had poisoned my own childhood and adulthood. Mark supported me fully, understanding that this was about breaking a cycle. The children's innocent questions and hurt were a constant reminder of what I was fighting for, a future where respect and love were not transactional, where family meant safety, not pain. Throughout it all, I maintained a calm and assertive demeanor, even though beneath the surface a storm of emotions raged. Every phone call, every message from my parents was met with measured responses or silence. I refused to engage in their attempts at guilt or manipulation. Instead, I let the actions speak louder than words. The message was clear. I was no longer their safety net, their convenient scapegoat, or their invisible servant. I was a woman who had finally drawn a line. Their shock was immediate and palpable. The control they wielded for so long began to slip through their fingers like grains of sand. I imagined Gerald pacing the floor, furious and bewildered as loan officers called to collect, while Evelyn faced pointed questions from their social circle that once admired her grace. Ryan, without the shelter of my financial and emotional support, struggled to grasp the new reality. It was a reckoning long overdue. This week of upheaval wasn't easy. I felt the weight of severing bonds, the ache of exposing family secrets, and the loneliness of standing apart. Yet beneath the hardship, a fierce sense of liberation bloomed. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving their cruelty. I was actively dismantling the power it held over me. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for whatever came next. The moment I pulled back my support, the Stewarts began to unravel faster than I could have anticipated. The financial strain hit them like a wave. Unpaid bills piling up, overdue notices flooding their mailbox, and the looming threat of foreclosure casting a dark shadow over their home. I could almost hear the creak of their carefully maintained facade cracking beneath the pressure. It was a quiet chaos, the kind that breeds desperation in the silence of a once stable life. Their calls started almost immediately, Gerald's voice shifting from the usual authoritative command to a tense, pleading tone. "Brenna, this is just a rough patch. I need you to help cover the mortgage this month. Please, don't let this spiral." Each call felt like a dagger twisting in a wound I was no longer willing to tend. Evelyn followed in her own way, her words smooth but laced with a venomous undertone. She knew exactly how to weaponize charm and silence, alternating between coy smiles and cold reminders. "We're still your family, Brenna. Don't forget that," she said one afternoon over the phone, her voice a velvet trap. I answered when I chose to, carefully measured responses, never committing, never giving them the leverage they sought. "I'm reviewing my finances right now," I'd say softly, knowing full well it was a gentle deflection. Desperation seeped through their voices, but I would not be drawn back into their web. I was done being the crutch that kept their crumbling world from collapsing entirely. Meanwhile, Ryan floundered in the sudden absence of my financial and emotional support. I saw the shift in him subtle at first, a hesitation in his usual confident swagger, a flicker of doubt behind his eyes. Without the safety net I'd provided, he stumbled over bills he never learned to manage, phone calls from creditors he couldn't answer. The golden child's armor was brittle when stripped of privilege and protection. I caught glimpses of his frustration during family gatherings, glances that darted away when locked with mine, as if searching for a lifeline he knew was no longer there. The social standing the Stewarts had so carefully cultivated began to fray as well. Evelyn's glossy veneer, polished by years of networking and charm, dulled under the whispers spreading through their circles. Friends who once toasted to their success now exchanged wary glances, their conversations punctuated by hushed questions and half-heard rumors. The community I'd once hoped might offer them support was quietly turning its back. I watched from a distance as their warm smiles froze and invitations dwindled without explanation. Desperation turned to frantic attempts at manipulation. Gerald's calls became more frequent, his tone teetering between anger and pleading. "Brenna, you don't understand what's at stake. This family needs you. We can fix this. Just help us one more time." But I saw through the facade. His words were not apologies. They were demands disguised as vulnerability. Evelyn's messages grew colder, veiled threats hidden beneath the saccharine language of familial duty. "If you walk away now, don't expect any more kindness from us," she warned, her smile a sharp blade. Yet I stood firm. I refused to be pulled back into cycles of guilt or obligation. Each message, each call, was met with calm but unyielding boundaries. I crafted my responses carefully, choosing silence when words would only fuel the fire. I told Mark about every interaction, drawing strength from his steady reassurance. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly one evening, his hand resting on mine, anchoring me when the emotional tide threatened to overwhelm. Family friends who once unquestioningly supported my parents began to hear a different story. My careful disclosures, shared with trusted confidants, peeled back layers of deception. The narrative shifted, no longer just a family struggling through hardship, but one marked by entitlement and neglect. I sensed their solidarity moving away from Gerald and Evelyn, tilting cautiously toward me. It was a subtle, powerful shift that unsettled the Stewarts more than any confrontation could. The golden child's confidence faltered visibly. Ryan's attempts to engage me were met with polite but firm distance. He struggled to navigate the new reality without the invisible shield I had unknowingly provided. In a family fractured by long years of favoritism and neglect, his vulnerability was a quiet, unspoken consequence, a crack in the polished image his parents had crafted. Through it all, I maintained my composure, even as the tension thickened like a storm overhead. The house that once echoed with forced smiles and muffled resentment now hummed with an uneasy silence. I felt the weight of the rupture I had initiated, but I carried it with a sense of hard-won resolve. The stakes were high, and the fallout was painful, but I knew this was the cost of reclaiming my dignity. Each day brought new challenges, calls unanswered, confrontations avoided, boundaries enforced. But beneath the surface, a transformation was underway. The family that had long depended on my silence and sacrifice was beginning to see the consequences of their cruelty in real time. The power dynamics shifted, subtle yet irreversible. Control was slipping through their fingers, and for once, I wasn't the one left holding the pieces. The fallout from my withdrawal hit the Stewart family like a cold wave crashing over a crumbling shoreline. Almost immediately, unpaid bills began piling up on their kitchen counter, envelopes stamped with red past due notices accumulating like a physical weight, pressing down on their already fragile facade. I could almost hear the shuffling and grumbling behind their front door, the tensions rising with every ignored phone call and unanswered letter. Creditors were no longer patient. Calls from collections agencies became frequent and insistent, their threats of legal action looming like storm clouds threatening to burst. Gerald, once the unshakable patriarch, began to unravel under this mounting pressure. I heard from a distant cousin that his health was deteriorating, the stress manifesting in sleepless nights, and a persistent cough that refused to fade. The man who had once commanded respect with his sharp business acumen now seemed a shadow of himself, frustrated, angry, and desperate as his carefully constructed empire teetered on the brink. His usual bluster gave way to frantic phone calls, first to me, then scrambling to other family members, each conversation a frantic attempt to patch the widening cracks. Evelyn's social world, long polished to a high sheen with her charm and carefully curated smiles, began to fracture as well. The dinner parties that once hummed with laughter and polite conversation grew sparse. Invitations dwindled. Friends, once enchanted by her poised grace, now exchanged furtive glances and whispered rumors behind her back. The delicately woven web of social standing she had built was slowly unraveling, exposing the sharp edges of manipulation and neglect that had lain beneath. I heard stories from mutual acquaintances, questions about unpaid debts, whispered mentions of family drama that painted a far less glamorous picture than Evelyn's public persona would have anyone believe. The strain extended beyond finances and social circles. Publicly, the Stewart family's relationships began to fracture. At gatherings, the tension was palpable. Conversations grew clipped, smiles forced, and silences stretched long and uncomfortable. The once tight-knit family appeared fractured and fragile, the cracks in their veneer showing to anyone willing to look closely. Even Ryan, the golden child, visibly struggled. Without the safety net I had long provided, his confidence wavered. I caught fleeting glimpses of frustration and uncertainty in his eyes, moments where the weight of expectation and newfound responsibility seemed almost too much to bear. He was no longer the untouchable favorite. Instead, he was exposed and vulnerable, stumbling as the foundations beneath him shifted. In response to this unraveling, Gerald and Evelyn resorted to desperate measures. Their calls to me became a relentless cycle of pleading and accusations, words laced with thinly veiled threats and emotional manipulation. "Brenna, you don't understand what's at stake here," Gerald would say, his voice wavering between anger and desperation. "We're family. "You owe us." Evelyn's messages were equally calculated, her smooth tone masking a venomous undercurrent. "If you walk away, don't expect kindness from us again." Their attempts to guilt me into compliance revealed the true nature of their control, a toxic blend of entitlement and cruelty. But I stood firm. Each call and message was met with calm, measured responses, designed to maintain my boundaries without igniting further conflict. When words failed, I turned to silence, an unyielding barrier that refused to invite manipulation back into my life. I shared every interaction with Mark, drawing strength from his unwavering support and steady encouragement. His quiet reminders that I was doing the right thing, that our family's well-being came first, became my anchor amidst the storm. Meanwhile, the narrative within our social circles shifted dramatically. Family friends who had once accepted my parents' crafted story of hardship and resilience began to hear a different version, one backed by the evidence I had quietly shared. Whispers of entitlement, deception, and neglect replaced the former admiration. The community, once an audience to the Stewart family's projected image, withdrew its support, sending a ripple of isolation through Evelyn's social network. Ryan's struggles deepened as the safety net I had provided disappeared. His attempts to reconnect with me were met with polite but firm distance, signaling a boundary he hadn't anticipated. Without the financial and emotional cushioning, he was exposed to the consequences his parents had long shielded him from. In this fractured family dynamic, his vulnerability was a quiet but powerful testament to the cost of favoritism and neglect. Through all this, I maintained my composure, a calm eye in the middle of the family's escalating storm. The house that once echoed with forced smiles and unspoken resentments now felt eerily silent, the weight of rupture pressing heavily on everyone inside. I carried the burden of consequence with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, knowing that this painful upheaval was necessary to reclaim my dignity and protect my own family. Each passing day brought new challenges, calls unanswered, confrontations sidestepped, and boundaries enforced with unwavering resolve. But beneath it all, I sensed a transformation taking root. The family that had long depended on my silence and sacrifice was beginning to face the real costs of their cruelty. The balance of power was shifting, subtle but irreversible. Control was slipping away from their grasp, and for the first time in decades, I was no longer the one left to hold the broken pieces. The weeks following the fallout brought a stark, unshakable reality. The Stewarts were forced to confront a new order, one where I no longer played the role of their silent victim or financial safety net. Their world, once comfortably propped up by my efforts and sacrifices, was beginning to crumble under its own weight. The choice lay before them, clear and unforgiving. They could accept this harsh new reality or face the consequences of permanent estrangement. No more chances, no more silences to fill the void of cruelty. I had spent years nurturing hope that things might change, that my parents might see me as more than just a burden to bear or a resource to exploit. But the family dinner where Gerald spat out those words, "You're a burden, get out," had shattered any lingering illusions. That moment was a reckoning, a turning point where hope gave way to resolve. Now, I was done waiting for apologies or recognition that might never come. Instead, I set firm boundaries, clear terms for any future contact, respect, equality, and accountability. Without these, the doors between us would remain firmly closed. It wasn't an ultimatum born of anger or spite. It was an act of survival. I understood that love unaccompanied by respect was not love at all, and I realized that forgiveness, while often portrayed as noble, can sometimes become a trap that chains us to patterns of pain and neglect. I was reclaiming my power by insisting on dignity and fairness, by refusing to accept anything less. Establishing these boundaries was both painful and liberating. I informed my parents through carefully considered letters, outlining what I would and would not tolerate going forward. I made it clear that any attempts to manipulate or belittle me would result in no response, that I would no longer be available to patch their crises or absorb their blame. The letters were composed with the same precision I applied to my work. No emotion-laden accusations, just facts and firm declarations. It was a language they could understand, the language of consequences. My husband, Mark, was my steady partner throughout this process, a constant source of support and strength. We talked late into the night about how to protect our children from the toxic dynamics that had shaped my upbringing, about how to build a family culture rooted in respect and mutual care rather than conditional love. Mark reminded me often that boundaries were not walls, but bridges, pathways to healthier relationships, or, when that failed, the guardrails that kept us safe from harm. In setting these terms, I also opened space for healing, though not the kind my parents might have imagined. Healing for me was about rediscovering my own worth, about nurturing connections that were reciprocal and genuine. I poured my energy into my immediate family, Mark and our children, who showed me daily what unconditional love looked like. Their laughter, their trust, their simple presence became a balm to wounds I had long hidden. True friends, too, stepped forward in this new chapter. Those who had witnessed my struggles but never judged, who offered empathy instead of advice, understanding instead of pity. Their support was a reminder that family extends beyond bloodlines, that chosen family can be a sanctuary where respect and kindness are the foundation. At the same time, I mourned the loss of the family I had hoped for, the one where love would not be measured in sacrifices or silence, where I could belong without fear of rejection. That grief was a quiet shadow that followed me, but it no longer held power over my choices. I recognized that some bonds, no matter how deep their roots, could only survive with mutual care and honesty. Without that, distance was not just necessary, it was protective. The Stewarts' forced reckoning underscored a hard truth. Respect is earned, boundaries protect, and blood does not excuse abuse. I held on to that truth as a shield and a guide. Each time my phone rang with an unknown number, a pang of anxiety surfaced, but I reminded myself of the wall I had built, brick by brick, boundary by boundary, to safeguard my peace. This transformation was neither instantaneous nor easy. There were moments of doubt, flashes of loneliness, and the echo of years spent trying to please those who would never be pleased. But there was also a growing sense of freedom, a lightness that came from no longer carrying burdens that weren't mine to bear. With every day that passed, I grew more certain of the life I was forging, one where my voice mattered, where love was not a transaction, and where I was no longer defined by the pain inflicted by others. The family dinner at that worn oak table became a distant memory, a catalyst rather than a cage. The future stretched out before me, uncharted, but promising. And though the path ahead would have its challenges, I knew I had taken the first and most crucial step, reclaiming my worth and choosing peace over pain. The doors to my family's past remained closed for now, but the doors to my own life and my own happiness were finally opening wide.